I'm Sarai.
And I'm Haley.
And this is Seamwork Radio. Welcome back to Seamwork Radio, where we share practical ideas for building a creative process so you can sew with intention and joy. Today, we're talking about the editing process for your wardrobe. And we're going to cover why editing is so important in design, how to set constraints to make editing easier, and ideas for making tough choices a little bit easier. All right, Haley, our icebreaker for today. What music is on your sewing playlist this month?
This is a fun one. And full disclosure, Sarai and I had to look at our Spotify.
Yeah, we've just been staring at our phones for like 10 minutes
to figure out what exactly we've been listening to. As we're filming this, it's early January, and so lots of December for me was Christmas music.
Yeah.
But another playlist that I had in heavy rotation was a 1970s playlist, and it had a lot of like Lou Reed and Patti Smith and David Bowie on it. So
all great choices.
I stand beside every single one of them. What about you, Sarai? What are you listening to?
I was looking at mine, and I've been listening to a lot of Nina Simone lately, and always. I just love Nina.
Can't be mad at that.
Amazing. Baltimore is one of my favorite albums, and Ken gave it to me on vinyl for Christmas, maybe the year before last. And I have it here in my sewing shed, but my record player is broken. So I have been listening to it on Spotify lately. And it's such a beautiful album. If you haven't listened to either Nina Simone or that album in particular, Baltimore, it's wonderful. So, and all of her albums are beautiful. All right. Well, that was a fun way to start this episode today. If you have an icebreaker for us, leave it for us at seamwork.com/go/icebreakers, and we'll likely use it on a future episode. That link will take you to a post on our community where you can share your idea for icebreakers. All right. Today we are talking about editing. So editing is a really key process in Design Your Wardrobe, which is our process for helping you to design a seasonal wardrobe. And when you think about designing, you often think about iterating and creating designs, but the real power can come when you edit out ideas. So editing is really the process of taking a wide range of ideas and narrowing them down into a more defined concept. And honing your editing skills, it's really what's going to help you to create the wardrobe you really want and to make impactful choices when it comes to sewing. Because otherwise, you often end up with things that you like, but you don't necessarily like to wear. So there's a difference there. So tell me a little bit about your editing process, Haley. What do you like about the editing process?
I have to say I'm like a little bit of an editing nerd. I love editing. I get such enjoyment from just like making, even just like editing text. Mm-hmm. I love making ideas concise and really digestible because I think that ideas are more, to me, maybe this is just my brain, but I find ideas oftentimes to be more impactful the more concise they are. Our like brains cannot absorb and remember huge pieces of information. And I think that's the same for like inspiration, that it can be really hard to focus ourselves unless our inspiration is the correct bite size for our personal preferences. So I think like in general, those are the things that I like about the editing process. Like the specific thing I love making cuts. Just like just be like brutal cuts. I'm really into it. My husband is always like, he'll ask for my design input often when he's working on an architectural project. And he also admires my ruthlessness.
That's a really good quality to have, especially when it comes to design, being able to do that. I think you make a really good point about the similarities between editing in this context and editing in, for example, written word or something like that, because I do feel like design is sort of a process of storytelling. Mm-hmm. And if you can simplify a story down to what's really important about it, then your point comes across so much more clearly. So I think that's a really apt metaphor. I don't know if it's a metaphor, it's an apt comparison.
Uh-huh. What do you find that you like the most about the editing process?
I think the freedom that comes from less. is very inspiring to me. So I think being able to, I find it difficult to make those cuts and to take things down to the basics, but I think there's a lot of freedom once you do it, and being able to see that clear picture once you've made those difficult decisions, I think is really inspiring to me. So again, it kind of comes back to storytelling and being able to gain more clarity.
Yeah. Where is there a place that you find that you struggle the most with editing?
I struggle with it everywhere, really. I'm definitely somebody I like to collect things and gather things, and I'm always looking for more ideas. So being able to cut some of those ideas feels very painful to me. And it's hard for me to distinguish between 100 different ideas that I love and really choose the best ones. But that's why it's so important to me, because it is such a struggle. That means that it's probably even more necessary for me to do, just because it's very easy for me to get overwhelmed, whether that's with the number of projects I have going on, sewing projects, home projects, whatever it is, or the things I commit to in my life or whatever. That's definitely always a struggle for me, which is why editing is so important. What about you?
I feel like for me, making cuts is the easy part. I feel like it's the front part of the work, which we're going to get into in a little bit here, which is setting the constraints that help you to make those editing decisions easier. Because I feel like once you have a set of constraints, the choices usually come second nature. So I think for me, the hard part is just setting those constraints, and depends on the context in which I'm setting them. If it's for a brand or for seam work, I have data that can help me to back my decision. Those are constraints that are easier to set. Setting the constraints for myself can be a little bit more challenging, personal constraints. We have some good tips to get into on all of that in just a few moments here. Before we do, though, I have one more question, and that is, how has your editing process evolved over time?
I think it's become a lot more structured. I think in the past, I was definitely more just, when it comes to sewing, at least, I would make whatever I felt like making, and which is fun. And that's one way to go about it. And I'm sure many of you do the same thing. But over time, I've become a lot more structured in designing what I sew. And that has really helped me to make better choices about what I spend my time on. And it's also allowed me to make things that actually work with my life and work with who I am as a person. And it just makes me a lot happier with what I actually create in the end. So having a structured design process has been really life-changing for me, and has taught me a lot about other areas of my life and how to pour more design into different areas of my life, which has also been really, really helpful. What about you?
Yeah, I agree. I think that when I first started sewing and creating things, that came from it was very like intuitive. And as a result of that, my editing was, I don't even know if it really existed. It just was a stream of consciousness. And then as I started developing my editing skills, it started from a place of intuition, and then it moved into, learning to utilize constraints as a tool, data. When you're designing for a brand, you do need to lean into what people actually want and buy. But I think that it all came together when I learned to combine all of those things, because constraints are lovely and helpful in the editing process, but you do need to also be in touch with what feels right.
Yeah. I think another thing that might be a factor, especially in our personal projects, is I do feel like when you're younger, you lean more towards experimentation and trying new things and just kind of figuring yourself out. And as you get older, not only do you have a better sense of what your own style is and what's important to you, but I think you just gain that skill of being able to say no to things that don't fit who you are anymore.
Yeah.
And I think that's much harder to do when you're younger and you haven't quite figured that out yet. And I think that's a totally normal and natural and healthy thing to go through at all stages. I don't think there's a right or wrong or better, but it's just something that for a lot of people, I think changes.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's these like times where you're like more in touch with your constraints naturally. And then there's other times where you need to figure them out a little bit more. And that's totally okay.
Yeah.
Or times when you just don't need constraints at all. You just need to have fun and explore a little bit.
Yeah.
Well, we keep on talking about all these constraints, but we ought to dig into them a little bit deeper. So we're going to jump into our tips for editing. And number one, surprise, surprise, set design constraints. So design constraints are really any practical consideration that limit your range of options. This is really great because that forces you to combine elements in new ways or to create some creative solutions to problems. So what are like some things that can be design constraints? They could be as simple as the weather. What is the weather like, the time of year that you're designing for? What do you do day to day? Are you a lawyer? Are you in the courtroom? You may not need to make a whole bunch of new loungewear, but if you work from home, I don't know, maybe you do. It can also be the fabrics you prefer to wear or fabrics that are appropriate, again, for the climate that you're in. So design constraints don't have to be complicated. They can just simply be the facts of your life.
Yeah, I think this is like a really huge one for me, at least. I think this is something that's really changed the way I sew and wear clothing.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like when I was younger, I used to just like what I liked, and I would wear things or buy things that were totally not, I would say inappropriate, but they were not like the garment you would think would be appropriate for a certain situation.
Mm-hmm.
For example, I just would wear what I want. And I feel like nowadays I take a lot of these considerations when I'm deciding what I'm going to spend my money or my time on. And even if I really love to wear something, it might not be practical for me to wear it very often. And that definitely factors into what I want to actually make.
Yeah, definitely. I feel that. I mean, I remember the days when I used to be totally willing to go stand out in line to go see a show in a mini skirt in the freezing cold.
Mm-hmm.
And you know what? Not so much anymore.
Yeah.
If it's going to be cold, I'm going to be warm.
Yeah, I remember the days, and I had a job working, a very physically demanding job working in a warehouse, and I would still wear dresses just because I liked wearing dresses. It was totally impractical for what I was doing, but I was 22 or whatever, and that's what I wanted to wear. Not saying that's a bad thing. It's just something that's changed again over time, and now I'm just a lot more choosy than I used to be.
I mean, and a constraint for some people may be that they don't really like that. Those kinds of factors don't impact their choices as much.
Right.
And for you might have like hard limitations on those things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's all about getting in touch with what matters to you and what's important to you. All right, the next tip is to look for outside systems to help you with setting constraints. So what we mean by that, by outside systems, is if you have some difficulty figuring out what kinds of constraints would make sense for your life, you might like to use something like color seasons or could be body types or something like that that can help you to kind of put boundaries around what you want to invite into your life, what you want to sew, what you want to wear. So I think those can be really, really helpful. They're not helpful for everyone, but if you are having trouble editing, they can be really, really good tools to help you set those constraints. Do you use anything like that, or have you ever?
I'm curious about those things. I wouldn't say that I'm necessarily like, I don't personally use them as constraints in my wardrobe. I mean, but I definitely have colors that I just don't feel as good in, and I don't like wearing close to my face, or silhouettes that I just feel like don't bring out the best in me. It's not necessarily about what's most flattering or not, or what makes me look the smallest in my body. It's just the things that I don't feel like are like personal reflections of how I want to be perceived.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think even even if you don't believe these things are necessarily like if you take the body types thing for an example, even if you don't believe that is actually something that exists or something that is objectively helpful, I think even just having boundaries that make sense to you can really help you to just make some kind of choice if you have trouble making choices. So
definitely.
I think it can still eliminate some of that mental taxation, even if objectively it doesn't make a big difference if you're this type or that type.
Yeah, totally.
If that makes sense. Yeah. I think they're really interesting to learn about. I've never really dug too deep into them, but I think they're kind of interesting.
Yeah, I know I've said it on previous podcasts, but I'm like, if anyone out there listening is an expert on one of these things, we would love to talk to you.
Yeah, definitely.
I'm very fascinated. Okay, so let's jump into tip number 3, which is repetition is useful for your wardrobe and don't be scared of it. So when you're looking at your inspiration in your outfits and fabric choices, it's important to think about what you most frequently wear and also what you're most willing to repeat time and time again in your wardrobe. And it's also important when you're seeking inspiration and throughout the design process, whether that's looking for the inspiration, shopping for fabric, creating your looks, you want to make sure that what you're creating is proportional to your real life and your real life constraints. So for instance, if you wear a blazer 4 times a week, then looking for a lot of different inspiration and outfits and fabrics that are appropriate for a blazer makes a lot of sense for you. But if you never wear a blazer, maybe you could edit all of those pictures of blazers out of your inspiration, unless that's something that you're really looking to incorporate in. So focusing on repetition, but also making sure that it's proportional to your unique constraints.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, and that looking at what you've done in the past can provide a lot of information for what's going to work for you in the future. So I think that's it's a really helpful way of thinking about it that will actually, I think, be extremely practical for a lot of people too.
Yeah. And I think you have to also get kind of acquainted with how comfortable you are with repetition. Some people like to wear basically an iteration of the same thing every single day. I think it was my friend Christine who called dressing like this, like a Flintstone dressing, where it's like the same thing over and over again, maybe in a different color. Although I think that the Flintstones just wore the exact same thing. But some people love doing that and some people don't. So the variety in your wardrobe, or the variety that you want to have in your wardrobe, should be reflected throughout your design process.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I feel like this is something that's changed for me as well, where I used to be really into having a lot of variety, and now I'm a lot more comfortable wearing elements that are the same, multiple times a week. And it feels good to do that. Tip number 4 is to go with your gut. So if you have hesitation about a certain silhouette or a color or a fabric, there's a high probability you're not actually going to wear it. So I don't think this is always true. There are some times when you might want to experiment with something that you're not quite sure about, and maybe it will work out. But I think just listening to what your gut says and how you feel emotionally about certain things can really help you to make those decisions, especially if the decision is something that you're kind of waffling on and you're not quite sure about. Or if you're choosing between 2 things and it's been really hard for you, then going with your gut can really help you to, I think, learn things that might not be apparent to you consciously. I'm reading this book right now called The Extended Mind, that's about thinking outside of your brain. So thinking using your body, using your social networks, using the environment. And I think there's a concept called interoception. So being able to understand the feelings that are going on in your body and interpret them. And I think that's a really interesting way of thinking about it, in that your thoughts don't just occur in your mind, they're occurring also in your body. And the more you can tune into those, the more you can really make better decisions. So I think that's a really interesting way of looking at it.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of when in doubt, go with your gut. Okay, our next tip is to make sure that you're doing multiple passes. Don't do all of your editing all at once. So this is kind of related to going with your gut, but I always like to do my first pass as just like gut feelings of what needs to be trimmed, and also trimming out anything that I feel like is really repetitive in my inspiration and my fabric selections and my iterations, things like that. And then my next few passes are cuts where I am getting really analytical about constraints. So you can go kind of one constraint at a time. You can look at like, okay, this next round, I'm going to look at weather or climate constraints, and you can eliminate all of the things that don't work for the climate. Your next round after that can be lifestyle constraints, and you can eliminate those things by taking this more like systematic approach. It can be a lot easier to make significant edits because you're not editing it down by, 50%. In one pass. You're just eliminating a couple things every single pass.
Yeah, that makes it a lot easier. And then finally, the last tip is that editing is perpetual in your wardrobe, and it's really there at every phase. So you're editing, starting with your inspiration. When you're collecting inspiration, you need to edit that. And then if you create a mood board, there's an editing process there. And then in choosing fabrics that you're going to sew with, and creating outfits. And then finally, when you purge your closet and decide what you want to keep and what you want to get rid of, you're also editing there. So editing is this ongoing process that happens throughout the life cycle of a piece of clothing, especially a piece of clothing that you're making. You're able to make even more editing decisions when you're sewing something than just when you're buying something. So just remember that that is something that you're going to be doing continually. It's not something you need to do once, a single decision, but something that you can do over and over. And because of that, if you can hone the skill and really get good at editing, it's going to benefit you all across the board as you create, as you sew, and as you build your wardrobe. So it's a extremely useful skill to have, and it transfers to other parts of your life too.
Yeah. I found that when I learned to be more concise or more decisive in my professional decisions, that it like really had a trickle effect. And I imagine it probably would have the same effect if you started one place and then it'll reach its little fingers out to other places.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, just to recap for you guys today, the tips we shared for editing are: first, to set design constraints; 2, to look for outside systems that can help you to set those constraints; 3, to remember that repetition is useful for your wardrobe; 4, to go with your gut when you're not sure; 5, do multiple passes to make decision-making a lot easier; and 6, that editing is perpetual in your wardrobe and it's there at every single phase. All right. What's your big takeaway from this episode, Haley?
Oh gosh, I don't know if I have one like specific takeaway. I just feel really nerdy about how excited I am to talk about editing. I just am really passionate about this, and I feel like it really is the secret sauce. So that's really my only takeaway. Sorry, it's nothing like mind altering.
Well, for me, editing is something I've been thinking a lot about as we start this year. So we're recording this in early January, and I'm embarking on a project this year to really try and slow my life down. I'm writing about it on my personal newsletter called Making Time. If you guys want to subscribe to that, we'll put a link to that in the show notes, I guess. But I'm trying to really slow down by culling things out of my life, starting with clothing, but, including a lot of other things too. And that's a difficult process for me, but it has a lot of really, really positive effects. And I find that when I can make those really tough decisions and pare down what I invite into my life, then my life is a lot happier and I'm able to appreciate what I have a lot more. So it's something I've been really, really thinking about a lot. And a lot of these tips, I think, apply outside of the realm of just design or outside of the realm of sewing your own wardrobe. I think they are all applicable to multiple aspects of your life. So if you struggle with doing less or having less, I think you can approach it in this very creative way and see it as part of a creative process rather than a sacrifice that you need to make. And for me, that's been a really helpful mindset shift. All right. Well, speaking of editing, one thing that really helps me with editing and with setting constraints is having a really great grasp on what my own personal style is. And if that's something that's interesting to you, you might be interested in our style workshop. So the style workshop is a hands-on workshop that walks you through exercises to help you identify your core style. And it's also a really great process to go through before you tackle any other kind of wardrobe planning. And it's free for Seamwork members, but if you aren't a member, it's only $10. And again, it's free for all Seamwork members. And if you want to join Seamwork, remember that podcast listeners get 50% off the annual membership at seamwork.com/go/podcast50. And you can check out the style workshop at seamwork.com/go/style-workshop. And we'll put those links in the show notes as well. And if you liked this episode today, please consider leaving us a 5-star review. We would love to hear from you. So you can leave that on your podcast platform of choice, whether that's Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you're listening to us right now. We really, really appreciate and we read every single review. It means the world to us when we hear from you guys with a positive review. You can also follow us on YouTube at Seamwork Video. You can follow us on Instagram at Seamwork. And if you'd like to join Seamwork and become part of our private community, plus get access to hundreds of sewing patterns and dozens of sew-along classes, our podcast listeners get a 50% off lifetime discount when you join at seamwork.com/go/podcast50. So that's seamwork.com/go/podcast50. And that's it for us today. I'm Sarai.
And I'm Haley.
And this is Seamwork Radio. Seamwork Radio is brought to you by the team at Seamwork. Seamwork's an online community that supports you in creating a wardrobe that feels right for you. When you join us at Seamwork, you become part of our private community of makers, and you also get access to monthly sew-along classes, a library of over 200 sewing patterns, and tons of great resources to help guide you through the sewing adventure that you choose. Podcast listeners can get half off a Seamwork Unlimited membership, which means you can download as many of those 200 plus patterns as you want at any time, and our community will be there to guide and support you. If you'd like to join us for half off, just visit seamwork.com/go/podcast50. You can also find us on Instagram at Seamwork or visit our YouTube channel, which is called Seamwork Video. We love hearing from you, so let us know if there's a topic or a personal story that you'd like us to cover. Thanks for listening to Seamwork Radio.